Hello and a warm welcome to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. The same faces, the same issues, the same conflict. Israel and the Palestinian negotiators have returned to the negotiating table in search of peace, or at least that's the stated goal. However, after 4 decades of occupation, 2 decades of the so-called peace talks, what makes this new round different? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my guest in London, Rachel Shabi. She's a journalist and author of the book, Not the Enemy, Israel's Jews from Arab Lands. We also have Matthew Harris. He's a liberal Democrat blogger on Israel and the wider Middle East. And here in the studio with me is Dmitriy Mariasis. He's a senior research fellow at the Department of Israeli Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Okay, Rachel, if I can start out with you. Why now? The same faces, the same issue, the same conflict. Do you expect anything different this time round?
Well, you know, it's really hard to not be cynical about this peace process, especially, if you've been watching the situation in the Middle East and seen these kind of round after round of go nowhere zombie peace talks that seem to always end up in failure. I think the reason it's happening now is that it's very much a kind of American-driven last-ditch attempt to get the two sides together before, as the US sees it, it actually becomes untenable. The idea of a two-state solution to the conflict becomes untenable. Certainly the Palestinians, they're the weaker side. They're not really in a position to do anything but go along with this. It's not like they can say no in the face of international pressure. And for Israel, the peace process has always been a nice process for Israel because it enables really business as usual on the Israeli side. Most settlement expansion happened during the Oslo peace process years. Israel is quite mindful of other forms of international pressure emerging. We've seen the EU become more forceful in its recent guidelines over funding to Israeli settlements. Looming ahead in September is the UN, at which the Palestinians now have status by which they can hold Israel to account, potentially, in international courts. So this is a very sort of convenient holding pattern for Israel. But it's really hard to imagine that anything fruitful will come out of it.
Okay, Matthew Harris, it's useful for the Americans, it's useful for the Israelis. Is it useful for the Palestinians?
I think it's extremely useful for the Palestinians because it's got to be in the long-term interest, or for that matter, the short-term interest of Israel, the Palestinians, and the wider Middle East to have peace. And it was only a few weeks ago that the Americans were launching what they called an economic peace plan for the Palestinians, which emphasizes the need for development of the Palestinian economy so that, everybody who lives in Israel and Palestine can get on with their lives and stop having this conflict. And I think it's easy, as Rachel says, to be cynical, but I suppose the hope for peace between Israel and the Palestinians is a hope that I first had at quite a young age, and perhaps that's why I'm able to hold on to my lack of cynicism about it, and they've come so close before.
Yeah, Matthew, but as time goes on, as time goes on, there's less and less of Palestine to make peace with. You don't have to be cynical to look at that. What was the comment I came across this morning? Dealing with Netanyahu is like splitting up a pizza while he's eating it. Okay, it's quite interesting to me. If I can go to Dmitry here, by the time they get to some kind of peace, if that's ever possible, what kind of Palestinian state will there be?
Well, first of all, I'm not quite sure that we're speaking here about the situation where, Israelis coming to Palestine, taking more territories and so on. Of course, there are some steps, some laws about building some houses, some buildings, but I think it's a political reaction. Actually, these last laws were not fulfilling. Israel didn't use it. The last law to build extra buildings on the E1 zone in Jerusalem was just the reaction to the Abbas coming to UN and claiming to become a non-member of UN. And just after it, we saw this law. It's just a reaction because it was a unilateral move from the Palestinian side, and then it was a unilateral move.
Going
from
to the
Israeli
United
side.
Nations. Going to the United Nations is the most multilateral forum in the world.
No,
Rachel, go ahead, weigh in here, because just as I was coming to the studio here, I checked antiwar.com. It's one of my favorite websites, and it's believed that some secret letters were sent to the Palestinians and the Israelis before the process started on Tuesday. And Obama promised that the 67 borders are not going to be hard. That means they're not going to be, that's not the end result. The right of return is going to be rejected. And the status of East Jerusalem isn't even on the table. So, I mean, what in the world is these negotiations all about? The three most important things.
Well, I think that's exactly the right question. I mean, just to put this into the context of what we're dealing with here, we have the most pro-settler Israeli government in its history. We have a cabinet that openly derides the peace plan and talks about, bits of the cabinet talk about annexing the West Bank. We have most of the cabinet refusing to even contemplate the idea of a shared Jerusalem, which, as you know, is one of the tenets of any peace agreement between Israel and Palestine. And in terms of building settlements, you know, they have grown exponentially over the last year. There has been the biggest spike in settlements for quite a few years. It's now at a 7-year high. There are 520,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. the E1 area, well, yes, the government did say it was going to start authorizing construction in that area as punishment, quote marks, for the Palestinians for daring to go to the UN to ask for member status. E1, anyone who travels through that area knows that the Israeli infrastructure is already in place. It's already been built up. All it's awaiting is those actual physical Jewish homes. So in that context, you're right. It's really hard to imagine what on earth this Israeli government is going to agree on. And bear in mind that it's dealing with the Palestinian Authority, which doesn't even represent the 1.6 million Palestinians living in Gaza. So what authority do they have in any case to make any sort of agreement with Israel?
Dmitriy, you were disagreeing and then you were agreeing. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm disagreeing about the most right-wing and not pro-Israel government in Israel. Let me remind you that during the Netanyahu in the cadence as the prime minister during the 90s, the Wario plantation and Hebron were made, and Yitzhak Molcho, who is now the personal assistant to Netanyahu in this in the future talks, who will be sitting next to Tzipi Livni, he was that person who really got signed and did this and fulfilled the agreement it was with the Palestinians.
Well, I know, all of us are aware of we almost were there. We can go to Camp David, but the fact of the matter is it's still a huge problem, and Palestine is slowly but surely disappearing. Matthew, if I can go to you, we have Martin Indyk is going to be heading the peace negotiations, and we have Samantha Power at the United Nations, and during her confirmation saying that she would do everything in her power to get Israel a seat on the United Nations Security Council. So we have Samantha Power, we have Martin Indyk. So where does this put the United States? I'd like to point out, too, that Martin Indyk has been accused in the past of actually giving secrets, American secrets, to the Israelis. What kind of fair broker is that?
Well, Martin Indyk is one of the American diplomats who came closest to achieving peace between Israel and the Palestinians in the past. Therefore, I would argue he's someone who is ideally suited to bringing the parties together now, because what this is about is a rational dispute between two peoples who want one territory and are trying to find a way to split it. Thrown into the rational dispute are all sorts of less rational things to do with different people's religious faiths, but it's got to be possible to reach agreement, because if you look at the Clinton parameters and the deal that so nearly was achieved in 2000, it's got to be possible to achieve something like that, to make a deal between these two people. And I really don't think that we should despair or be cynical.
Rachel, I mean, now we have the Palestinians have 22%, and now there's negotiations over that 22%. And, you can look at these numbers, but you have to even get smaller. 4 or 5, 6% can make the difference between a successful state and a failed state.
The trouble with what you were just discussing regarding the U.S. is that, for a long time, they have not been honest brokers in this dispute. They have been much more backing the Israeli side. And we can see that in the kind of the kind of measures that it has taken. So, for instance, the last time there was any sort of vague attempts to reconcile the two sides, we saw President Obama back down on his request that Israel enforce a temporary partial freeze on settlement construction. So if he's not even able to make any sort of insistence on that with penalties, consequences for Israel if they don't measure up, where on earth is the pressure on Israel to come into line and actually sit at the table and make any kind of reasonable agreement? And that is the problem, of course. I mean, Matthew talks about this being quite a straightforward conflict. He's absolutely right. It could be solved in half an hour. It's really not that complicated. But there has been historically no willing on the Israeli side to make any sort of concessions that would result in a viable, independent Palestinian state. And I would like to see now any evidence to suggest otherwise for me to start being more hopeful about this peace process.
Okay, I have to jump in here. You're listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I am Peter Lavelle, your moderator. Matthew, would you like to reply to what Rachel just said?
Yes, I think with respect to Rachel, what she was doing there, in my mind, was sort of blaming the Israeli side. And there are people on the pro-Israeli side who sometimes blame the Palestinian side. And we can cast around a great deal of blame for who is responsible for failing to end this conflict. Or we can just wholeheartedly support the fact that the greatest power in the world, namely the United States, has managed to bring these two parties to the table. Because a few weeks ago, all the commentators were saying, John Kerry's wasting his time. Why is he bothering to do this? Nothing will happen. And now here we are. We've got these final status talks that are actually happening.
Well, okay, Dmitry, it seems to me, and maybe I'm going to be more agreeing with Rachel, everyone's being set up for failure because everyone's going to turn around and say, well, see, we sat down, we talked for 90 days, we didn't get a result, and then we're going to wait another 2 years and then for the next president after Obama, and then you'll have settlements from all the way to the River Jordan, and there will be nothing to negotiate. You'll have one state, and I don't think the Israelis want that. You'll end up with one state if we don't get some kind of closure relatively soon.
I'm sorry, you're just saying that Israel historically doesn't want the peace. But remember, the year 2000, the Camp David, they almost agreed to divide Jerusalem. They almost agreed to leave 98%.
But why should we live in a world of almost? Why don't we live in the world of certainties?
I'll tell you, because it was Yasser Arafat who denied this agreement. And he was blamed even by the leaders of Saudi Arabia for denying the agreement proposed. It is important to understand. It is one thing. Another thing. Now, let us think, okay, tomorrow we're coming to a conclusion. Tomorrow. And what's gonna be when the rockets would fly from Gaza to Israel? Does Abbas really control Gaza? No. Who is controlling Gaza? Hamas is controlling Gaza. Does anyone in the world has any seizure of control of this part of the Islamic Brotherhood organization? No, because Israel left.
But if peace is made, then why would Hamas fire rockets?
I'll give you an example. In 2005 in August, the Israeli government seized every presence of any Israeli on the territory of the Gaza Strip, and there is no infrastructure, no any settler, no any soldier, but the rockets flew. But I'll give you advice for.
But it continues to be blockaded and sieged.
No,
okay,
but
this is the reality here. I mean, I've heard the Israeli side. We left Gaza. No, Israel hasn't left Gaza. It was after
the first rockets flew. But I'll give you another example. In the year 1947, when the resolution in the UN General Assembly came up, Israel received less than it wanted to receive at the state of Israel. It didn't receive the whole Palestine that it wanted. But they decided, okay, let's agree, and we're going to work, we're going to build our state on that territory that we were given by the UN. And the other sides didn't agree about it.
Then why is Israel colonizing? Why is it colonizing land that it conquered against international law and the Geneva Conventions? It is illegal under international law to do that.
First of all, I think that it is a mistake by the Israeli official government and the establishment to continue expanding the settlements. I think it is a major blunder that they have Israel have to stop it. I agree
I think,
on this.
and Rachel, if I can go to you, I mean, this, again, I hate to sound so cynical, but it seems to me that, this settlement buildup, it's really, it's a cynical gamble where the Israelis will end up saying, well, we'll withdraw from here, here, and here, but we'll keep this, and this, and essentially make sure that there's no vibrant economy, a state that can survive on its own. It will be dependent on Israel in one form or another. This is a really cynical plan because you have these outposts and say, well, we'll get rid of these outposts. You see, these are concessions we're making. We're making concessions. But this is still occupied land.
Let's be clear about this. The Israeli settlement project is Israel's biggest national project. It is all Israel does. It's not, I wish it was better invested in the things it wants us to think is better invested in, like the startup nation, like the scientific breakthroughs that it makes. However, unfortunately, the one thing that Israel has done consistently since 1967 is to expand this settlement project. Huge amounts of resources are funneled into this project. We don't know how many because the government has always been very opaque and diverse about the way it funds these settlements, but it's certainly at the expense of Israelis living within the Green Line, of that we can be sure. Ariel Sharon, one of the former prime ministers of Israel, actually said it. He said to settlers that they should run to the hills and seize as much land as possible because everything in Israeli hands would stay Israeli. Now, I'm not saying this especially because it's Israel that's doing it. It could be any country doing it, and I would say the same thing, because that is the logic of occupation. You do not give up power voluntarily. Nobody does. Why would we expect Israel to? Why would we expect it to behave any differently from any other country that's in power? The only way to persuade countries to give up occupation is through applying international pressure. And so far, there has been a complete absence of that international pressure being applied on Israel, which is why this and all peace processes before it are destined to fail, because there are no penalties built into that system.
Matthew, would you like to weigh in on that? Because as Rachel pointed out, I mean, any country that is, as far as I know, this is the only colonization project in the world today, is the colonization of the West Bank. No other country is doing this, but it's okay because it's Israel, and it's okay because Israel is protected by
the United States. There's a little place
United.
called the Western Sahara, in terms of the Chinese occupation of Tibet, the Moroccan occupation of the Western Sahara, and in terms of Israel's willingness to
and they all are supported.
We've already heard about dismantlement.
And these other projects are supported by the United States in the United Nations. Correct? They're very different. Very different cases when American taxpayers, billions of dollars go into a project, as Rachel pointed out, that is opaque. Go ahead, Matt.
The American taxpayer actually gives a lot more money to Egypt than they give to Israel. And one of the things that it's important to point out is that if you look at the Camp David agreements between Israel and Egypt in the late 70s, early 80s, Israel then withdrew from territory, uprooted settlers. It was actually Ariel Sharon who was in command of doing it, even gave up oil fields that were of enormous value to them. They did that because they saw it as a way of having a durable peace with Egypt. And in fact, despite everything, peace with Egypt has endured. And if you talk to people who live in Israel, there are no limits to the things that they are prepared to give up in return for what they see as a genuine, lasting peace.
Okay, Rachel, would you like to react to that, Rachel?
I would, because unfortunately, that is not what all the polls have consistently shown in Israel. Every poll has historically, Matthew is right, has historically shown that Israel does want a peace solution with the Palestinians. The majority of Israelis are in favor of a peace solution. But when you drill down into the details, it transpires that, 2/3 of centrists, centrist Israelis are not willing to share Jerusalem. The majority are not willing to contemplate any kind of solution of refugees. So when you actually drill down into
the polls show most Palestinians wanting.
I'm just responding to the point that you made about Israelis. That was a direct response to what you just said.
Matthew?
I think one can argue about different polls, some of which give great cause for pessimism, some great cause for optimism. That there are Israeli people who, if you say to them, are you prepared to make the following compromises which would leave Israel incredibly vulnerable? They'll say, no, of course not. Then if a persuasive leader stands up and says, are you prepared to make far-reaching compromises in pursuit of a genuine, secure peace with guarantees that we're not going to be vulnerable afterwards? The vast majority of Israelis say yes. And there's polling that shows that a lot of Palestinians say that actually they only see a two-state solution as a prelude to destroying Israel, and pro-Israeli people always get terribly blood-curdling about this. But I'm absolutely convinced that the vast majority of ordinary Palestinian people
all right, Dmitry,
let me have compromise in pursuit of peace.
Okay, Dmitry?
Yeah, the year of 1948 to the year 1967, for 20 years, these two territories were under the governance of the two Arab countries, Jordan and Egypt. I have never heard about the idea of of independent state in these two territories for the 20 years. I remind you that even the citizens of the Gaza Strip were not allowed to have the Egyptian citizenship.
During that time, they didn't have a colonization project in the West Bank.
Who are they? Israelis didn't possess this territory, and then they won the war in 1967. They won this war.
You cannot annex territory through aggression. They started the war in 1967.
Why did they start the war in 1967?
It's immaterial. It's immaterial because the fact of the matter is there's a colonization project going on in the West Bank against international law. It's immaterial.
This territory back in return for peace. What was the response from the Arab League? It was the three no's: no to peace, no to recognition of Israel, no to talks with Israel.
But the Arab League has had an initiative in place that it has reiterated now 3 times, which has been 3 yeses, and Israel has completely ignored it. I mean, the landscape has changed, and the fact of the matter remains that it is immaterial to go back and say, but they did this and we did that. The fact of the matter is that Israel is defying international law over its illegal occupation of Palestinian land. That's it. That's all we need to focus on. How to best get the international... It is, of course it is. Of course it is.
That the Arab world is still full of countries that don't recognize Israel's existence.
Absolutely.
Rachel and Matthew, I have to jump in here. You're listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. Rachel, finish your point, then I'll go to Matthew. Go ahead, Rachel.
I was simply going to reiterate that Arab League initiative, which is all those Arab League countries saying that they would recognize Israel in terms of if there was a peace agreement with the Palestinians. But yeah, ultimately we have to find a way to get Israel to comply with international law, because it is, as we know, breaking that law and in its illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories at cost and at suffering to the Palestinians. Now, I don't think the peace process is going to be the best method of getting Palestinians, getting Israel to comply with international law. I think that there are other means that might provide better results.
Well, Rachel, if I can go to Matthew, I think that's exactly the trajectory that the Palestinians are taking is going through the United Nations. This is getting them some traction because 20 years of talking have just seen, like I've said earlier, we're seeing Palestine wiped off the map. So what do you think about that, Matthew? They're going to the international law and conventions to get their statehood that they have a right to.
I think that the problem is that the agreements that the Israelis and Palestinians entered into specified that the way this conflict had to be resolved, and both parties signed up to this, was through negotiation and the avoidance of unilateral moves. And I would argue that when the Palestinians went to the UN in 2011, they weren't doing it in the serious expectation that the UN would vote to create them a state. They were doing it basically to score a political point and to increase the pressure on Israel. And I would argue that rather than doing that, the smart thing for them to have been doing would have been to saying to the Israelis, okay, Netanyahu, you say you want to talk, let's talk. Whereas instead, what the Palestinian president at that time was saying was, unless the Israelis agreed to certain conditions, the Palestinians weren't prepared to talk. Whereas what I would say is that there need to be unconditional talks, and that's why I'm very pleased that the Americans have managed to bring those kind of talks about, finally.
Okay, unconditional talks while the colonization of the West Bank continues. We have negotiations. Go ahead, Dmitry.
Okay, first of all, about the colonization, and you have to understand one thing. You're just talking about the colonization, you're accusing Israel. But let me just once again...
It isn't a colonization project? What would you call it then?
Well, I'm saying that it's the two sides issue.
It's very hard to convince the world that the Israelis have done anything nice to the people of Gaza. Rachel, Let's speak to me. We're almost out of time. Let's speak about, we talked about the Israelis and the Palestinians. Talk about the problems on the Palestinian side itself, because we have Mahmoud Abbas. I think you may of him, but he's not a very effective representative of the Palestinians, and I would even hardly say he does represent Palestinians anymore. What do the Palestinians have to do to get a stronger voice and a better leadership?
Well, one of the things, whenever you speak to Palestinians, that rift between Fatah and Hamas is one of the things that is cited as the most problematic and the most painful. All Palestinians want to see some end to that rift and some sort of Palestinian unity. But I think Palestinians as well, they're starting to move away from this kind of peace process two-state paradigm, in the sense that if Israel does, as its intentions suggest, actually just want to annex the West Bank, and certainly members of the Netanyahu coalition have been suggesting that as a solution, and the evidence on the ground would suggest that seems to be the way that things are headed. Palestinians are starting to say, okay, fine, then annex us. We don't really care that much about a state. What we care about is our rights. We want equal rights. We want our basic human rights. So if you're going to annex us, then
that's Israel's greatest nightmare, isn't it?
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you? But that is the trajectory of where things are going.
But then again, you'll have apartheid, or a different word for apartheid. We'll have second-class citizens. Matthew, what do you think about that?
I think that it would be a disaster, and that what we need to do as an international community is continue to foster the kind of situation in which the Israelis and Palestinians are able to achieve a two-state solution. But if you look at what's actually happening on the West Bank with the new city of Nawab, which is being created, if you look at the website of an organization called Portland Trust, which is a British organization doing a lot to develop the Palestinian economy, there are incredible signs of hope, and it's the hope that we need to focus on. We have to create a Palestinian state because the people who live there, the Palestinian people, are entitled to self-determination, and we also have to guarantee peace and security for Israel, because the people who live in Israel are entitled to lead lives free of the threat of violence. So I think all talk of annexing the West Bank is almost a distraction from the overriding task, which is to support these peace talks.
Dmitry, what political will is there, because it was mentioned earlier in the program, within the Israeli government to get an agreement? It was already pointed, there are many members of the cabinet that are just scorn the idea of having even talks. And maybe only on that case that I can actually agree with them, because it's a waste of time. It's just a sideshow to divert attention, because there are no preconditions to this. This is what Mr. Kerry forgot. So over the next 90 days, it's business as usual. So I'm going to give you the last word here. Could we see a third intifada?
I'm not sure that that's on the horizon. However, you do hear a lot of Palestinian officials talk about the next war with Israel, but it won't be on the ground. It will be at the UN.
Okay, I want to thank my guests today, Rachel, Matthew, and Dmitry here in the studio with me. You've been listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. Stay with us.